Thank you so much. I'm from the University of Calicut. So, law for the Slovenian Hegelian philosopher Žižek is not the constitutional law, but the Freudian law of fire and brimstone, of cast in stone pronouncements of the commandments. So, there is a transformation in Žižek from the Freudian law to the Lacanian laws of love. So in Lacan, as feminist scholars like Laura Mulvey would argue, there is a kind of science of love. So Zizek borrows from Lacan, whom he called his master in a Hegelian fashion. So Hegel is the other philosopher whose theory of the Geist Zizek uses. So for Zizek, the Ten Commandments of the Freudian Testament are essentially various strategies to keep the neighbor, that's one's proximate other, from invading one's space. For Zizek, multiculturalism is the logic of capital whereby numerous choices are offered to the consumer. For Zizek, beer without alcohol or chocolate without constipation or those things that are devoid of their pathological aspects is the very hallmark of our ideology. So for Zizek, the neighbor is the epitome of Catholic love because neighborliness essentially brings with it conflict, and it is part of the proximity of the neighbor. So, apart from Lacan and Hegel, the theology of the English novelist and writer G.K. Chesterton is used by Žižek so much so that he calls Chesterton another of his masters. So, Žižek uses Chesterton, who quotes from the Old Testament book of Job, where the chosen people are saved from eternal damnation and decay because they, in a covenant with Jehovah, had a choice of endorsing worldly wealth with virtue and poverty with vice, which they did not choose. This could have left men in an unflattering position and women of trying to make successful people good rather than the good successful. So Zizek's point here is that the radical gap, which he calls the parallax gap between virtue and wealth, underlines the triumph of virtue. The virtuous thereby are seldom affluent, and virtue is its own reward. So this is a negative concept because Hegel famously is a thinker of negativity, where he aggrandizes the negative so much so that it becomes the world spirit in which the wealth is compounded in reverse, wealth accumulated to the point of spectacle, which for Hegel is someone like the Emperor Napoleon on horseback. So it is eternally divided. So borrowing from the French philosopher Alain Badiou, Zizek posits that the eternal idea is that idea which allows divisions. So Badiou proves this using set theory as ontology. An eternal idea is not some sort of spurious infinity. It is, on the other hand, a gap. Spatially, Zizek says that the universality of the present world today lies in the universality of its struggles. The real, for instance, is the superimposition or the coincidence of the struggles. He combines this with popular culture. So when Zizek goes to a spatial location in Asia, like for instance South Korea, Zizek is not interested in the art house cinema of South Korea. He, on the other hand, would want to visit a multiplex, and he would like to watch the latest potboiler blockbuster film in South Korea. So here he borrows from the Old Testament book of Job, where God himself doesn't have an idea of what's happening to Job in the Old Testament. So for Žižek, it is the father who dies on the cross. So there's a parallax there as well. So it is in the Holy Spirit that the nation state arises in the guise of religion for Žižek. So Zizek majorly criticizes the Dan Brown novel because he goes into popular culture as he would go into Beethoven or Mozart. The central characters, he sees that they cannot have a physical union in the present like they do in most Hollywood films, so that uh, in the holy figures in the ancient past can couple. So for Zizek, the new materialist ideology, as espoused by great philosophers like Graham Harman, Quentin Meillassoux, Levi Bryant, Ray Brassier. So this new materialism at the same time foregrounds the physical presence, the real DNA of Christ the King uh, in lieu of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. So this for Zizek is the parallax gap between these two. So it's a gap which is the most important Zizekian idea, so to speak. So the Lacanian real for Zizek lies in the gap. It is in the difference, which is not just a difference, but the difference is constitutive, because once this difference disappears, reality itself would dissolve for Zizek. So for Zizek, temporarily, perpetuity of the eternal idea is the perpetuity of this division till eternity. So non-all is his favorite idea, where non-dead is different from undead. Very controversially, he calls the woman unman and not non-man. And virtue is not the opposite of vice. On the other hand, Zizek calls virtue unwise because it is eternally divided in an undifferentiated manner where everything flows into everything else in a darkness of the universe into a multitude. So morality in a Nietzschean sense is a conspiracy. The substance and its subject are synthesized by the splitting, by the parallax. So it is the very subject that persists retrospectively the substance. So here again, Zizek uses another very important Hegelian idea of absolute recoil or absolute Gegenstoß. Sorry for my mispronunciation, where the uh, idea is in order to have been or future anterior. So Zizek's example is that of the English philosopher Bertrand Russell confiding his love to his the socialite Ottilie Morel, and only after this confession of love does Russell realize that he loved this woman. So this Zizek calls the absolute recoil, where the recoil is itself the substance. So subject retrospectively creates the substance. In that sense, the son is father. That's framed by Zizek in that manner. Lacan was there, and therefore Freud. So the Freud-Lacan equation is reversed. Just because there was Lacan, there was Freud. So the concept of great poets and their descendants is reversed in this manner. Just because there was Chesterton, you have say Kafka, and not because Kafka there is Chesterton, but Chesterton therefore Kafka. So here Zizek introduces the idea of absolute recoil. So for Zizek, instead of the Cartesian pineal gland, which unites the mind and body, it's the very gap where the body and the mind merge. So for Zizek, there is no such entity as the human animal, and there is no rapport sexual, as Lacan would say. So sexuality is the realm of the real, and jouissance is the greatest acme of human evolution, which Žižek quotes Schelling to substantiate, which is the primordial inchoate your sphere. So for Žižek, a couple might exchange looks, gestures, suggestive words, but this noumenal mystical speech must not be fetishized. It must not be given some kind of instrumental consistency into some kind of speech before speech or a basic primordial form of speech. It must not be something that reduces normal speech to supplementary status. Like for Lacan, just because of silence, you have speech. So, speech, voice is the bridge from the real to the symbolic world, from the nominal, inaccessible, mystical world. The bot of Sharon, so to speak, is voice. But even the voice is predicated upon silence. So Zizek resolves this using the trope of the absolute Gegenstoß and future anterior in order to have been. He illustrates this by using the example of Russell, and there is the great liberation theologist from India, Bishop Paulos Ma Paulos. And when Paulos Ma Paulos went to visit Pope John Paul II, there was a discussion apparently between them on why the Christian faith could not find as many believers, followers in India as did elsewhere in Europe and advanced parts of the world. And so one possible answer was that Indians, owing to various historical reasons, could not attain the developed level of intellectual thinking collectively because of colonialism and monarchy and lack of various lack of resources and poverty, various physical factors, various material factors. But on the other hand, Bishop Paulos Ma Paulos countered this by saying that no, in fact, ideas like the Holy Spirit, Geist, are already there in Indian philosophy. Like the Shaddarshana Advaita of Shankaracharya. So in that sense, the primitive, so-called primitive thoughts of the East even predate, the idea of Christian emancipation for liberation theology. So this is the idea which Žižek introduces with absolute recoil. So he says that the Bodhisattva is that Buddhist figure who, owing to pity for the fallenness of humans, would come down after attaining moksha or nirvana. And this he equates with the Old Testament book of Job, where God himself is fallen and God himself is joining the lamentation of Job. So for Zizek, at a certain point, Geist entered humanity and there was a qualitative change happened. So humanity at some point was developing quantitatively, and Geist joined humanity and humans became a different socially altogether. So for Zizek, new materialism, technological advancements are ushering in a new phase, similar phase, where humans are entering, a kind of alien phase where we become aliens to ourselves. So these three concepts, the parallax, absolute recoil, and the real, are the three major concepts that Zizek foregrounds theologically, and because he calls himself a Christian atheist. And the effect is strictly retroactive. For instance, Žižek says that the world of physics is like that of a video game, where once you go into the peripheral aspects of a video game, some of that aspects might already have been programmed. But once you venture too far away from your destined track, you would find that there is no universe programmed over there. So Zizek says that the similar thing happens in the real universe as well, where the world has not been totalized. There is no totality. There is a kind of gap in the world. But no programming figure, of course. But he calls himself a Christian atheist because it is in that function, it is in that imaginary function that he posits the deity, the divine figure for Zizek is in that Geist, which is very important for Zizek. And it is in that imaginary, real, symbolic, and the imaginary figure, he would say God. God is that kind of absolute recoil. So he says that in Shakespeare, like for instance, you have female actors playing men who are again acting as women. So there is a double dissimulation, and Žižek says that this is impossible for a male actor to be a woman acting again as a man. So this he says just for a provocation's sake. But so there is no absolute coincidence of faith. There is only an absolute Gegenstoß. In that sense, God is a retrospective effect of that devotion, of that belief, of faith, or even ideology, which is embodied so ontologically. So in order to be liberated, one already has to be free. So in this way, Žižek is elliptical and mystical at times, and therefore, even though he may not like it, he can be framed in this mystical, spiritual fashion, which I am trying here. And that's all I have here. Thank you. Hello? Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, thank you very much. Very interesting paper. So we've made it to the end of the session. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. There's already some questions in the chat. So I'm going to read the questions. If you have a question, you can put up your hand, or you can in the little handy thing on Teams, or again, you can type your question if you wish. If the speakers would like to turn on their cameras so we can all have a kind of a good dialogue. The first question that appeared in the chat was for, let me go and make sure I have the first ones. So this question is for Charles. Charles, can you expand on the notion of being housed in myths?
Certainly, and thanks to the fellow presenters for a really great session. This idea of being housed in myths is Moriarty's way of saying that mythology or stories, not saying that they're false or fake, myth as ideology, but rather myth as a story that we embodied, provide shelter for human consciousness. Moriarty's interested in this idea that for the human to be a human, much like we need a house in order to flourish or find a community, we need myths to understand who we are and how we relate to one another. So one of his key points is that we've organized the house of our myths so that we will use the world wrongly, we'll oppress ecology, we won't live with creation. And instead we can tell stories that won't separate us from the world, but invite us to inhabit it differently. I think this way of being housed in myths is one way that connects Moriarty to von Balthasar, in the sense that we are telling stories all the time, to be attentive to the way that those stories we're telling in both culture and in art are forming us to live in a certain way, how we're organizing the furniture or the layout of the rooms of the cultural homes in which we're making. Thanks for that question.
This is great. The next one that came in from the chat was for Martin. Martin, can you enhance the thought a little on how human consciousness can turn to achieve nonviolent love in contemporary subcultures where violence rules the day?
Well, I guess, I mean, the place to start is education, isn't it? I mean, with the Catholic Church as a global organization, there are